you? Maybe you wonder, what are two corners doing running a museum? With you, the founders and directors of the Museum of Neo-Extractivism, a project that began in 2014.
We were overwhelmed by the stereotypical imagination of contemporary art and postmodern culture. So we decided to get out of the bubble of the cultural or creative industry, and we decided to visit other industries. This is how we began our trip through different transnational factories. The first was BASF,
the world's largest producer of chemical. So we landed in a small big city factory located in Ludwigshafen, Germany. BASF is a powerful and amazing industry.
In 1880, the company, for the first time in history, acquired the patent rights for the color. Yes, the famous indigo blue. Yes, the color of the blue jeans. Thanks to the visionary German-American businessman Levi Strauss, who set up his business in San Francisco to dress the miners in the middle of the gold rush. Obtaining the first industrial patent for a color is not a small thing. A triumph for the textile industry, but a disaster for a modern nature. Of course, the blue pigments come from the exploitation of lapis lazuli, the stones that come from the mines of Afghanistan. But that is another history.
Yeah. For a few days we were visiting this large factory that produced cleaning supplies, such as bleach, for example. But also they produce candy and gum. Yes, they produce the flavoring chemical that we consume, like menthol and opanol. But that's not all. They have been pioneers in the production of fertilizers and agrochemicals, when in 1914 they achieved the artificial synthesis of ammonium nitrate, also very well known as salpeter or white gold.
Salpeter is also used for the arms industry due to its explosive nature, but that is another history.
As a paradox of the progress, this new technology resulted in ghost towns and abandoned mines in the northern of Chile. During our visit, we discovered that the influence of these companies is everywhere. In the colors we see, in the plastic of the bottles we consume, and even in the toys of our children. But don't worry. No, don't worry, because they also are thinking about recycling. And all these toxic gases from the factory are recycled, becoming the CO2 that we drink in the bubbles of our sodas or Coke. Yes.
In another building of this factory, they created a small universal museum, the Visitor Center.
The Visitor Center. Yes, the Visitor Center is a participatory and interactive museum that tells not only the history of the company, its products and the global influence, but also the history of the world defined by chemistry. Finally, our investigation has reached its destination. To our surprise, almost like an epiphany, like hearing the voice of God, this multinational proposed all questions and answers to the most urgent problems from the past, present, and the future.
What will the cities of the future will be? Where will we get water from? How will we supply food to all the humanity? Do you know? Well, they know.
That visit to the Temple of Chemistry was a great source of inspiration. So we decided to become the directors of our own institution, to play in response to the dominant monoculture, to create an imaginary museum, real or fictional, that works in reverse way to the pedagogical model of that visitor center.
For such reason, we created this museum. Yes, another museum. What else could be? But a museum dedicated especially to illustrating, denouncing, and disarming extractivism discourses inside and outside the cultural industry. This is not a horror museum, but it could be. We imagine a museum that narrates the neo-extractive present through an artistic investigation in the terrifying world of corporations. Their impact on health, socio-environmental problems, and human rights violations, and the rights of other species, like us, transgenic coral. Like any good museum, we create a collection inspired by the creation of many artists from different parts of the world. The museum has an educational program and also publications. In this museum, the term neo-extractivism is used not only to define the contemporary model of natural resource extraction, monoculture, GMO, fracking, fossil energy, etc., but also by the so-called cognitive extraction, the one that comes from the exploitation in culture and arts. Little by little, the Museum of Neo-Extractivism became a nomadic project with different formats depending on each context, space, or institutions where it's present.
So from this initiative arises the program Neo-Extra-Activism, a platform created especially for the Boris Lurie Fellowship at the Vera List Center for Art and Politics and the New School. It was a response to the call Ask for Protocols. And continuing on this line of work, this program will be developed over the next 2 years through different chapters that include laboratories, workshops, talks, performance and interventions, among other activities. This is an ongoing research and is based on 3 main axes: neo-extractivism, the problem; ecocide, the consequence; and Buen Vivir, good living, solution. The problem. Neo-extractivism is a model of economic development adopted at the beginning of the 21st century. Its stories stem from the so-called conventional extractivism, the accumulation model that began more than 500 years ago, after the European conquest and colonization of American, African and Asian territories. This is how the capitalist system began to be implemented through the world. Extractivism is a colonial and neo-colonial mechanism based on looting and appropriation. Neo-extractivism is the new extractive model, which guides the economy toward activity of extreme exploitation of nature in order to obtain unprocessed primary resources, raw materials. Neo-extractive exploitation is not limited to minerals and oil. It is also involved activities such as agriculture, fishing, and even the so-called cognitive extractivism. The term ecocide refers to any massive damage or environmental destruction of a specific territory. This can be irreversible when an ecosystem suffers damage that doesn't allow to regenerate. Ecocide can be caused by a living agent or the result of a massive contamination that destroys the fauna and the flora. Ecocide is the responsibility of human beings. The origin of this war comes from the times of Vietnam War, when the United States Army used the so-called Agent Orange, a defoliant that caused irreversible damage to the nature and everything that is around. Some years later, after the war, citizens created international tribunals in order to condemn the use of Agent Orange and to analyze environmental impacts of this biological and chemical agent on ecosystems and people. Since then, the term ecocide has been used as a category, classifying as a crime that violates the principles of environmental justice.
The developed model that is based on the destruction of the environment is in crisis. We live in a society of bad living, with an anthropocentric vision that considers nature as a simple natural resources. A model that appropriates ancestral lands, those territories protected by the defenders of lands, water and life. However, there are other models experiencing economies and worldviews, biodiverse cultures that have been raising possible solutions to this extractive development model, where the human being, the earth, and all the species that live in this big and huge land, it must be respected. One of the most exemplary responses to this predatory model was born from the indigenous nations of the Abya Yala territory, Latin America. It is the concept of Buen Vivir, an enormous contribution from the peoples to the peoples for the construction of a new way of life. For a society based on non-anthropocentric understanding of life, a political, cultural and social project coming from the indigenous communities for a global society that lives in harmony with the nature. In our program, we use the concept of Buen Vivir as a trigger to create a space for the colonization of knowledge, common pedagogies, and collective creation. A short history of an error that seems to have no solution. In 1979, 41 years ago, in the calm city of Geneva, Switzerland, the first World Climate Summit was held. Then, a worldwide climatological research program was launched. Since then, 9 years have passed until in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, was created. In their first report, they already warned about the effects of human activity on the environment. Since then, countries have met each year in the Conference of the Parties to try to reach an agreement that limits each country's emissions. A few years later, in 1992, the famous Earth Summit was held in Rio de Janeiro. This meeting was the origin on the United Nations Convention of Climate Change, an international agreement where the existence of climate change is officially recognized. The countries agreed that they should take action, but they did not take any concrete action.
Some years later, in 1997, the so-called Kyoto Protocol was signed. And that's where we wanted to go, to Japan, where the emissions limits were established for the different countries, but of course, with an exception for emerging and developed third world countries. So the poor countries will continue developing their economies. Such a great idea! However, at the end of the summit, the United States, the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, rejected the agreement. It was such a great failure that finally no country kept its commitment. We continue our trip through the world of failed environmental protocols, not without first drinking and toasting with a glass of champagne to the great Paris Agreement as a universal common initiative to combat climate change. This agreement was intended to provide a great support to help developed countries to implement such measures. We couldn't expect less from a protocol signed in France.
We can't stop to celebrate the Paris Climate Agreement. It was signed by 195 countries and tried to limit the increase in temperature, raise awareness about green, ecological, sustainable life. But years later, in 2017, again, the United States government made a decision. President Donald Trump announced that the United States will abandon the Paris Agreement on climate change.
My solemn duty to protect America and its citizens. The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord Thank you. Thank you.
Dear humanity, dear audience, we will continue with the failed protocols of COVID. But we believe that is enough at the moment. We don't want to demoralize you. So now, let's go with the last question. Do we need more failed protocols? Do we need more failed protocols? Do we need more failed protocols? Do we need more failed protocols?